Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this briefing. There's a lot to discuss. We've obviously been talking on social media and putting out some immediate feedback, but these webinars give us a real good chance to dig into the more detail, nuanced detail of every step in the supply chain, and that's what we're going to do. So we do have positive things to say. There's quite a lot of positive news that came out of Tesla's battery day last night, and there's also a lot of questions, but certainly on the upstream. So I'm going to first kick off with a presentation that puts this into context, and then we will literally go through all our analysts that we have on this call and give our initial reactions. And then there's a Q&A box at the bottom, so please do put your questions in there. We'll try and get through as many of them as possible. But the presentation first will give us a bit more context on what we're seeing. So firstly, this is the supply chain as we see it. And the first sort of big headline, really, the big standout one for us was that Tesla is now officially upstream. So we've always, you've known Tesla, a lot of you, for a long, long time. In 2008, start making vehicles, electric vehicles. And of course, Gigafactory begins and they start making battery cells, of course, with Panasonic, but really I feel that's as much as a Tesla process, certainly learning from Panasonic how they make that and how they scale it to a plant, 57 gigawatt hour plant. That's something like we've never seen before. So the Gigafactory for me is the biggest game changer in the lithium-ion battery industry since it began. It introduced scale for the first time, much needed, and helped drop that cost significantly. So that was in 2016 onwards that kicked off. Then, of course, the announcements yesterday, you've got Tesla wanting to build a cathode plant now in the US. So that for us is the first step into upstream. So that's a very interesting one to watch. We had a discussion and mentions on lithium chemicals. You could also argue silicon in there as well. And then, of course, we had the lithium clay situation was mentioned, which we'll dig into more and talk about the lithium market. So, you know, we do see Tesla now as being upstream, and it's a full supply chain focus, which is unique. So next big headline really for me was it's the world's first American-made electric vehicle battery. This has kind of been brushed over a little bit, but I mean, to date, I mean, this is the cell that was announced, and it's obviously a new cell. I colloquially called it a biscuit tin. It's not that big. Someone else said it's more of a baked bean can. I'm like, yeah, okay, that works for me. But very interesting. It's a major innovation. Of course, be careful of the headlines on the right. 5x energy is because it's much bigger. But the interesting thing is the range and the speed and the cost of production. So I believe there are physical benefits here more than energy density, straight chemical benefits. So everything you hear is in two buckets in this discussion. One will be the physical, the manufacturing of the battery cells. The other is the chemical, the electrochemistry, the cathodes, the anodes side. So try and put them in two buckets and think of them in that process, because there's a lot of numbers flying around. It can get confusing. Why is this the world's first American-made EV battery? Because the only other two plants at the moment in the US that you're getting these electric vehicle batteries from are LG Chem in Michigan, which is a South Korean company, and AESC Envision, which is a Chinese, now a Chinese-owned company in Tennessee. That's the old plant that used to made the batteries for Nissan Leaf. But more of these battery mega factories are happening. They are coming. SK Innovation in South Korea, SK Innovation, another South Korean company building two plants in Georgia. Tesla in Texas, which is becoming not just a battery cell plant, a massive one, but also a materials hub. So that's a really interesting strategy to dig into more. LG Chem, again, LG Chem with General Motors. That's a very famous JV now that's being pushed ahead, one to watch in Michigan. And then Farasis want to put a plant in America as well, and they're a Chinese company. So as you can see, now officially these cells are being made by Tesla, not a partnership. It's the world's first American-made electric vehicle battery. Now, I wanted to put this in because, of course, Tesla announced that their pilot plant in Fremont was just that, a pilot plant, but it's 10 gigawatt hours. It's going to 10 gigawatt hours over the next sort of 10, 11 months. So to put it in context, As it stands now, if it was active at 10 gigawatt hours, and we believe it's much lower than that, but the ramp is coming, it's the 13th largest lithium-ion battery plant. So it's funny, the Tesla scale is different levels. It would be counted as a major lithium-ion battery plant, but Tesla call it a pilot plant. So you can get an idea of the ambition and the scale going forward. Of course, you can see there on the far left, the number one, the world's biggest battery plant at the moment is the Tesla Gigafactory in Nevada, 37 gigawatt hours. And then if you look down, LG Chem and CATL are really the dominant players, the dominant competitors here to Tesla for cell capacity. Interesting to note, they're also partners with Tesla. So you can see it's not really a competition to be number one, it's competition to have scale and own that market, such as the rate of growth and the size of the future market in 10 years. Now, quickly before we get into the conversation and I introduce the analysts, this is the lithium-ion battery supply chain as we see it, as global production in 2019, the last full annual year. And as you can see, it's Tesla's goal to break down a China-dominated battery supply chain. Now, they won't frame it like that, but China, as you can see, does dominate most steps of this process. Now, especially, and the next slide will show it, especially the midstream and the downstream. So this is the midstream and downstream, the midstream and downstream. Now, this ties into Tesla's strategy yesterday that they outlined quite explicitly. So it definitely is a head-to-head, and it's very interesting to see this evolve. Now, what Tesla want to do before I get into the numbers on the midstream is, of course, you have to own the midstream, the cathode capacity, the battery chemicals capacity. There's two links in the middle. If you own that and battery cells, then the trade flows point to you. Now, this is, as you can see, the lithium mines are in blue, you've got cobalt in red, you've got nickel in dark blue. All those arrows point to China. Now, that's because the majority of chemicals, battery-grade chemicals are made there, and of course, cathodes as well. And as a result, battery cells, of course, the end market is huge, electric vehicles, so that's the reason battery cells are there. But arrows point to China. Now, of course, if Tesla are building this battery materials hub in Austin, they are, of course, but it will take them 3 years to really build this out. The arrows will begin to point to the US for the first time. That's something really important. It's changing the sway, the balance, if you like, of industrial power. And that is a really important part underpinning Tesla's strategy that they didn't mention, but it is that important in our eyes. Now, this slide is one of the final ones, but it shows the importance of the midstream. So there's a common misnomer, misconception in the industry, in general, not in the industry, but in the general world, that China has all these raw materials and that's why they own these industries. Not true. So of all the key battery raw materials last year, China only produced 23% domestically. But of this battery grade chemical refining stage, this really important step, 80% was produced in China. So that means that flow, that trade flow of raw material to chemical is going towards China. As a result, cathodes, anodes as well, very dominant, and lithium-ion batteries, very dominant. So the importance of the midstream, which Tesla announced yesterday, is crucial for us to controlling this supply chain. So, but, yeah, and this is the big but, and the questions will come, and we will tackle them as well as we can. Downstream, Tesla are comfortable. You heard of the battery cells, exciting innovations. They make excellent cars that are popular and increasing in sales, but the further upstream you go, the more questions are being asked, especially with the battery grade chemicals, and definitely with the raw material extraction side of things with lithium. So we will be digging into that, and I'm happy to answer your questions also. So 9 claims to discuss, and then I will get the analysts to turn on their videos and audios. The cell to pack, let's call this a downstream if you like, we can put it all in one. This new format, which is really cool and really interesting, the 4680, there's tabless design, which I think is just as important, especially for the charging, we can dig into that. The dry electrode process, that's all downstream, that's all manufacturing, speed and cost. Then we're getting into the chemical side more now, this electrode chemistry side. Cathode plant, this zero cobalt cathode idea, the silicon anode. I think this is an important one to really get a grip of before it runs away. Then upstream, lithium and this new nickel route. So we're going to talk all about those, and if I can ask all the analysts to turn on their videos and audios. And it's probably best to, Rob introduce me, but can you just give a two-liner on who you are and exactly what you do for Benchmark, starting with Vivas, then Caspar, then Miller, and then we'll kick off in this discussion.
Thanks, Simon. My name is Vivas Kumar. I'm a principal with Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. And as part of that, I'm involved with the strategic advisory practice for our largest clients, including governments, multinational companies in the supply chain. And as many of you know, I was previously a senior manager in the Tesla battery team.
I'm Caspar Rawles. I'm head of price assessments and data at Benchmark. So my team collects the data from the coalface, as it were. So we speak with the industry on a daily basis, and we basically collect and store the data, which feeds into the rest of the company.
And Andrew Miller, I'm product director at Benchmark. So I oversee a lot of the subscriptions and products that we put out. Effectively means that I'm jack of all trades, master of none, really. But yeah, happy to provide some comment today.
You're most welcome, Andrew. There's a lot of, well, let's get your initial reactions, actually. That's probably best. There's so many ways to cut this, because there's literally a million things discussed yesterday. Andy, initial thoughts?
Was that me? Sorry, Simon.
Yeah, you can start as well.
Yeah, like I think your chart pointed out perfectly. I think a lot of the statements that were made in terms of what they're looking to do downstream make a lot of sense as they work their way upstream. The logic behind that, of course, the internalization of the supply chain, being able to cut those costs is so critical in what they're aiming to do. So it made a lot of sense. But I think when you get into those areas of chemical engineering, what's happening in the raw materials, even delving into the sort of mining side of things, I think more questions than answers really from my side. And I think there's still a lot to be done on that front. And I'm interested to see how that strategy really plays out over the next few years.
Yeah, Caspar?
Yeah, I kind of echo that sentiment as well. I think obviously what Tesla are setting out to do over the next 10 years and achieve is really impressive. And certainly the engineering that they've discussed, about the battery plant and the auto manufacturing, etc. I think they're kind of imminently achievable things that they can do. And it's really critical to bring the cost down. And if it works out, it will be the blueprint for the rest of the industry, I'm sure. But yeah, I think, as Andy said, as you move further upstream and you're getting into these chemical issues or chemical engineering, which, a lot of the things that they discussed have already been looked at by the industry for a long time. I think it wasn't conveyed at how challenging some of that stuff's going to be. And I'm not saying it's impossible and it won't happen, but I think there should have been, the timeline to do a lot of these is going to be a lot longer than was perhaps came across in the presentation, or longer than people perhaps expect. These are really challenging things that they kind of just said they would be able to do, and it felt like it would happen very quickly.
Yeah, and Vivas, you've been there and done it with Tesla before you joined Benchmark, especially on supply chain. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have plenty of thoughts. So first of all, when I left Tesla 16 months ago, and all of the projects that we saw being discussed yesterday were either already kicked off or deep into research by the time I left. In the 3 years that I worked at Tesla, I saw many of these things happening. So the first thing I want to say is, yesterday was not a presentation that was put together over the course of a couple of months, but really was the culmination of years of effort from the battery team, both on the commercial side and on the technical side. We've talked a lot on many of our benchmark presentations about how lithium-ion batteries are a core platform technology upon which EVs are built. It's taken 30 years of development for lithium-ion batteries to become this widespread in their use for electric vehicles, energy storage, consumer electronics, and industrial products. So it should be no surprise that it's taken years for Tesla to get to those announcements And it will likewise take years for them to implement the announcements that they made yesterday. And this isn't just an opinion that we're giving as independent analysts. I mean, on the night before Battery Day, Elon tweeted out saying, you know, like, I don't remember the exact words, but he basically said, hold your horses. This isn't going to happen immediately, and this is going to take years to play out. Something else that I think, if it wasn't clear up until yesterday, has become even more clear is Tesla is not a car company. Tesla is a battery and software company. And comparing Tesla to VW, BMW, GM, Ford, it just does not work. I mean, the level of depth of the discussion that was had, both positive and negative, around batteries yesterday, I think just serves to underscore that Tesla is not a car company. Now, there were some positives and there were some open questions for me coming out of yesterday. In terms of positives, it is that I think that they focused on the right metrics. Dollar per kilowatt hour, watt-hour per kilogram, CapEx investment is not talked about enough, but needs to be talked about. And, you know, range is a question that keeps coming up for consumers. And I hope that based on what they announced yesterday, which was a 54% range increase and a Plaid Model S at 520 miles on a single charge, that we can put the criticism that consumers have about electric vehicle range to rest once and for all. And, you know, I was pretty inspired by seeing they announced a 69% decrease in investment per gigawatt hour. Now, we don't know what the exact number will end up being, but just the fact that they're shining a light on this is important. Benchmark is tracking over 160 megafactories worldwide up until yesterday with a forecast capacity of over 2.5 terawatt hours per year. And this is going to take billions of dollars. So any effort made towards decreasing the capital expenditures is something that will reverberate across the entire industry and make this just a generally more investable space. What I also liked was the point about geopolitics that you made, Simon. Right before Battery Day was the Tesla annual general meeting. And one of the initiatives that was voted on was the initiative about transparency regarding cobalt supply chains. And it was proposed by a retail shareholder. So this is a concern that's gone well beyond institutionals and has been a reputational risk for a very long time with electric vehicles. When they were talking about initiatives around more American involvement in their US supply chain with the cathode, with chemicals and mining, it's been a long time coming that as a market leader, Tesla goes out and talks about geopolitics and supply chain. I thought the 4680 cell innovation was also a long time coming. Yes, Elon wrote off and said anybody can do a new form factor, but the truth is we do need more form factors. We do need more innovation in that space. And the final very positive element of the presentation that I liked yesterday was going cell to pack. We oftentimes talk about dollar per kilowatt hour on a cell level. There is a step up to go from cell to pack. It's a mostly mechanical process, and it involves modules and submodules. And the elimination of modules and submodules will further reduce costs at the pack level. And I think that was something that I wish had been sort of highlighted a little bit more, was the impact that going cell to pack will have on the affordability and on the bill of materials of electric vehicles. Now, open questions, of which there were a lot. Let's keep in mind that yesterday's event was, I mean, their presentation lasted, I think, just a little bit over an hour. Each of the individual sections that they presented could have warranted a 3-hour deep dive with analysts and technical teams. So, of course, the event should have generated open questions. Yes, I thought the timelines as promised were certainly interesting, to say the least. But beyond timelines, a few of the other open questions I had were, number one, they're promising a Terafactory at a smaller footprint than a Gigafactory. So what is actually the path to get there, right? And they're promising that at a 70% decrease in CapEx as well. So I just like to dig a little more into what are the actual steps to get there, because I think they gave a lot of high-level numbers with not a lot of background about what are the steps there. I still personally don't believe when they say that they're going to recycle batteries in 10 years. I think that the batteries are built to last 20 to 30 to 40 years. And I've been harping on the fact that when an electric vehicle is sold today, the person who buys that vehicle will hold on to that battery and just change their car body every 10 years. And potentially, vehicle companies will get to the point where you're actually paying a subscription for the car body and changing it out because the real value driver is the battery. I was confused when there were so many announcements about what they're doing to improve batteries that they also said in the same presentation, recycling is going to happen. We're just going to assume that it's going to happen after 10 years. I was pleasantly surprised by the discussion of silicon when it comes to anodes, but also surprised that they didn't talk about lithium metal anodes. We are going to dig into that a little bit later in this presentation. And my biggest open question, which is going to be most of today's discussion, was the entire cathode section of the presentation. Like all of the claims made regarding nickel and eliminating cobalt, basically everything to do with lithium that they stated. It spawned more questions than assuaged concerns for me personally. Specifically, at Benchmark, we track the supply chain for these materials. And when statements are being made like we're going to be doing 3 terawatt hours ourselves in 2030, the immediate question that we have is, how will you build a supply chain along with the expectations of 3 terawatt hours of battery capacity in 10 years? And while there was a lot of talk of vertical integration, I think that and maybe they just didn't have enough time to do this yesterday. Once again, each of the sections could have been a 3-hour presentation. I think that I came out of it with a little bit of a confused message around what they're doing with supply chain. So my final thoughts on this is, if anything, yesterday proved that lithium-ion batteries are going to be the core platform technology upon which electric vehicles are built over the next 10 years. I had a lot of questions around, is this when they're going to announce solid-state batteries? Is this when they're announce, different, something other than lithium-ion battery to be the propulsion source for their vehicles going forward? And the fact that the message was stuck to lithium-ion batteries indicates that that will be the core platform technology. This was a very engineering-heavy presentation. The people who were on stage in the latter half of the presentation are all, I've worked personally with all of them, but they were all the engineering managers. I was surprised that there wasn't a single supply chain manager or commercial manager, or even somebody from government relations, if you want to call it that, on stage, part of that discussion. The effects of the announcements yesterday, positive or negative, reachable or unreachable, will reverberate across the supply chain. It will force the other vehicle companies, the other battery companies, to also make changes themselves. And in the end, don't underestimate this company. Every single time Tesla has been counted out, they have been able to rise above it. But that said, it's less about the promises made by Tesla and the inherent limitations of physics when it comes to lithium-ion batteries, when it comes to mining, that will dictate what the future will hold over here. And that's not to say, I didn't believe what they said. No, what I'm saying is, inherent physics limitations will still hold. And designing towards inherent physics limitations is what's important going forward. So I know that was a little bit of a rant, but I thought that could sort of hopefully kick off the rest of the discussion for us.
No, it's excellent. It's really interesting. And some of you picked up on there. The one thing that I felt and noticed is Tesla are excellent downstream. The battery cells, they showed a deep understanding yesterday with the new format. Andy Miller, we remember even before Benchmark, the supply chain the battery supply chain is something I've been doing since 2006. Me and Andy worked previously in our previous company together, and before Benchmark was launched. And you remember the pre-Gigafactory, right? Speaking with the pioneers of these things, Kurt Kelty, for example, and speaking with him before the Gigafactory is even built, when it was just an idea. We've since spoken to JB Straubel as well about this, and these are really the pioneers that took this battery cell from an 18650. And I don't know the original reason that Panasonic made that shape. There would be a reason, but it probably wouldn't be product focused. It would probably be a battery reason or chemistry reason. But yeah, I mean, making that 2170, and now we've gone a significant jump further to this 4680. Miller, you interviewed Kurt a while back on this process. What are your thoughts on the format, first and foremost?
Yeah, so I think the format, you know, the difficulty and why most car companies don't utilize cylindrical cells is the management system, and having that many cells in one pack, you have a lot of constraints with what you can do there. So, you know, Tesla going from that 18650, which is what was in the industry at that point, building up an incredible pack infrastructure, a pack system around that, and then refining the cell from there onwards. You know, you're always going to see, I think, this evolution. And when we did speak to Kurt just it was like 2 or 3 months ago now, and I think he talked about that constant process of improvement that was underway, as Vivas mentioned, that engineering, that refining of the process, and never just, you know, accepting for what it is, always looking 2-3 years ahead on how to improve. So like you say, I think from a cell perspective, what you saw was not groundbreaking, but I think it's part of that continuous improvement of what you're gonna see from Tesla. As you say, I think when you consider where we were 6 years ago, and I think you can take something like yesterday and go, wow, there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot to comprehend. How much is viable? How much is not viable? But you and I will remember when Gigafactory 1 was announced and what people were saying at that point about the feasibility of that happening. We're there. We're there already, and you wouldn't put it past Tesla to be able to make significant advances from here onwards. So, yeah, incredible to see that change in such a small number of years.
The tab thing was really interesting as well. It was like, I mean, they said tabless, but really it's like one big tab, and I thought that was actually Elon did sort of stress that point, that was quite a big step, a big innovation for the battery cell sort of industry. So there is more improvement to come, even though it feels like the improvements are kind of getting less maybe. I mean, do you think we're going to end up with just one big cell? I know obviously the answer is no, but how far can you go? And I suppose only Tesla are willing to push that boundary more than the other conservative competitors.
Yeah, and I think they're the ones who built it from the battery pack outwards, right? And they've it gives them the flexibility that they have that management system, and that they have the expertise at that level of the supply chain to do more than obviously some others in the market at the moment. You know, you now have the migration of EV producers trying to only now just venture into the battery cell area of this supply chain. So if you consider this is what Tesla's been doing for 10 years plus, there's a long way to go for other companies, and I think it gives them a lot more scope to refine their process and refine the sort of format of the technology as well.
Yeah, Caspar first, and then Vivas. What do you take on the dry electrode Maxwell process? I mean, that was like a big, great hope, and I kind of felt a bit deflated. Elon seemed a little bit deflated. A little bit. It might be 50-50. We're still trying, but it's clear that there's a long way to go on that.
Yeah, it didn't sound like, I mean, Elon said it wasn't ready. It wasn't, it was still, I think they said that it sounded like it wasn't particularly consistent, which is something that's really important in large scale cell manufacturing. So it sounded like sometimes it works, but it's not very reliable. And there's some more, ground to cover on that, certainly in terms of its development, which, they still need to build these plants, right? So they've got a window before they need to have it commercially ready. But I think that's obviously a very challenging thing to do. Now, should they do it? Obviously, you could see from the presentation, there's a huge number of benefits. There's obviously the energy and cost savings, which is really, what's driving it. But also, if you can do away with the solvents, I mean, there's some of the more harmful chemicals, I guess, that's used in battery production. There, in terms of your ESG, if you can get away with that, that's very positive. You don't want to be using these, really powerful chemicals as much as they do at the moment. But yeah, it was the one thing I think that came across from Elon as it isn't quite ready yet, and whether they can deliver on that or not. That sounds pretty critical to scaling down these battery plants, which would be part of the CapEx reductions. Now, I don't know, you know, we've all been to battery plants here, and you've seen those giant ovens that they use to bake off the solvents on the anode and the cathode, or the water as well. And they're, you know, they're a major bottleneck in battery production, and they're huge, right? So that's going to be really critical for them achieving all of these milestones to get that net reduction in cost down. I think across to 56% they quoted, but yeah, I mean, I'd imagine it's all hands to the pumps on that to make sure it gets done.
And then scaling, Caspar, and just a bit on scaling, because you track our data on these battery plants, that the 1 terawatt, giga, what did Elon say? It was giga, tera's the new giga.
Yeah.
Well, it's mind-boggling, right? So just to put this in context, this isn't going from where we were in the battery industry in 2010 to the Gigafactory. This is infinitely harder, not just from a manufacturing perspective, but most critically a supply chain perspective. The raw materials, the engineered battery grade chemicals you need. Just because it makes sense then talk about scale and the challenges there. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have numbers as well you've got our numbers on Tesla and where we thought they were going to be in 2029?
Yeah, yeah, I can pull those up. But yeah, I mean, just to put it into context, I mean, as Vivas said, we're tracking it. The last count was 167 battery plants prior to yesterday's assessment, yesterday's announcement.
And it was, just for context, it was 3 when the Gigafactory was announced in 2015.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's gone from 3 to now tracking over 160, exactly 160.
And active plants, just finally, so to interrupt, is 83 we counted, right? That's in production.
Yeah, active plants today, I've just got the numbers here actually, is 87 by the end of this year. Now, of those 167 plants, all of that, every battery plant we're tracking, that total capacity by 2030 is about 2.7 terawatt hours. And Tesla yesterday said that they will produce, that's not capacity, produce 3 terawatt hours of cells themselves by 2030. So they'll be producing more than the current plans of every other battery company on the planet, or publicly available plan, should we say, I guess. Which just goes to show the scale of what they're suggesting is absolutely vast. I mean, the numbers are crazy. I think we had, I'll just pull them up. Tesla by 2030, we previously had them down as just over 200 gigawatt hours, which we thought was adventurous for a car company that hadn't produced any battery cells, or as of this year, you know, themselves, obviously joint ventures, but as of
and just for context as well. So the last year's production of batteries is around 200 gigawatt hours, right?
Bit less, yeah, like 180, something like that.
Yeah, the entire, and that's by one company in 2029. It's just context, but yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, and Tesla also said that by 2022 they'll be producing 100 gigawatt hours of cells a year, which is more than half of last year's production, just Tesla. So the numbers are huge; they're mind-boggling. And then the question really as well, I guess, with that is not only is that how achievable is that, you know, the rate of speed of building out these battery plants. They'll be building as much battery capacity as the rest of all of the battery companies in the world, but is where are those raw materials going to come from, and scaling that part of the supply chain. You know, there was a mention of a heavy dependence on nickel. Obviously, they're moving to more and more nickel-rich chemistries. You know, to build a nickel mine, now we're looking at kind of laterite H-power operations. That's a very slow process. That's going to take a long time. So all of these things need to be considered.
Yeah, definitely. The raw materials is so critical. Oversimplified yesterday. We're going to dig into it. We're going to dig into it now because Vivas is with us the next 20 minutes. We want to get Vivas's comments on lithium. I mean, lithium, the intermediate step of making these battery grade chemicals, it's something that, you know, we've discussed to the US Senate, for example, the importance of that stage 3 times now we've testified, right? Vivas, take lithium away and give us your thoughts on this.
I'm looking at the Q&A tab and I'm seeing a lot of questions about the lithium section. So hopefully we can address all of them here in one go. In yesterday's presentation, I thought the lithium section was the most confusing section, just to be frank. And it all started off with the statement of there is enough lithium in Nevada for, I don't remember the exact words, but it was like, there's enough lithium in Nevada for every vehicle in the US or every vehicle in the world.
Yeah, in the US, yeah.
Yeah, sure, that might be true on, and that might be true on an atomic level, but that, statements like that are quite damaging to the reality of how difficult it is to make lithium chemicals in today's current process. Like, you have to mine from economically viable deposits and make a highly engineered specialty chemical that then goes into cathode manufacturing, that then goes into cars. So I thought that was an overt simplification. And then to follow up on that by saying, we have a clay deposit in Nevada. My initial thought was, oh, well, I wonder if they acquired somebody with a clay deposit in Nevada. And we checked the usual suspects of mining companies and prospectors that have clay deposits. None of them put out a statement saying they'd been acquired. None of them had introduced a trading halt to their stock due to impending news of a partnership with Tesla. So I guess the only conclusion that we had to come to was they probably prospected their own land. And then the question was, well, how do they secure this land? What are they planning on doing with it? And, where does that rank in priority against all of the other projects? I mean, there were individually something like 50 different projects introduced by Tesla, each of which has a $1 per kilowatt hour impact, and each of which has its own capital and R&D expense associated with it. So the lithium section, for me, just brought up a broader question of, where does this rank against everything else, even though the message is a little bit confusing. And then the second portion of the lithium section that was a little bit confusing to me was there's a lot of discussion around elimination of steps when it comes to going from an atom that's in a mine on the ground to going into a vehicle. And yes, absolutely, from a first principle standpoint, if you eliminate steps, you're eliminating cost and you're eliminating variability, you're taking out risks in the supply chain. But I thought the jump of clay and spodumene to battery cells, that was just too far and too fast a leap without a discussion of what are the steps in the middle. There was some discussion about, we've got, if you mix it with an NaCl solution, you basically just add salt and water and you'll get what you want. And with all due respect, I just thought that was too simplified. And it just opened up a large can of worms for a lot of criticism when it comes to the lithium section, both from a technology standpoint and from a supply chain standpoint. The last point I'll make about supply chain is, what will be the commercial arrangement between the lithium supply chain and Tesla going forward if they are making these statements about making their own lithium? It's just a question to solve. I mean, will the world's largest lithium supplier still want to do business with a company that's going after their margin opportunity? And, on this note, I want to pass it on to Andy Miller, because he's done a lot of work in terms of tracking supply and demand capacities. And an inherent question now is, well, what will happen to the material that will not be fed to Tesla? And, where will that material find a home?
Yeah, thanks, Vivas. I think a really key point on that, and one thing that really stood out to me in the Q&A at the end, was the way it was sort of papered over. The question about whether, I think the question was geared at, what does your type of demand mean for the rest of the industry, even if you're making your own raw materials now? Is this going to, well, you're going to need some type of raw material, and what does that mean for everyone else out there looking for raw material? Does it mean that all of a sudden their prices become incredibly volatile, and obviously their efforts to reduce costs? In our models, when we're looking at the supply demand picture, we had 3 terawatt hours of demand somewhere in the early 2030s. So to think that Tesla themselves are going to try and do by 2030 3 terawatt hours, says a lot about how much the market's going to change. Now, on top of that, you have the fact that when you look at the lithium industry, or when you look at, any of the strategic materials going into this supply chain, you get somewhere in between 2023 and 2027, and all of these markets are facing structural issues. So, I think it's a very good question as to, one, how do other suppliers respond to this in the short term? Because ultimately, whether Tesla wants to develop its own resource in X number of years, until then, it's still going to have to source lithium from someone else. You know, I think in general, when you look at this, and I remember we had a lot of discussions about this at our Benchmark Minerals Week event last year, and I can't remember what prompted it at that point, but there was a lot of this talk, and I think around the middle of last year, you saw huge margin for micronized hydroxide in the market. So micronized lithium hydroxide that the battery producers were looking for was carrying a major premium on where your other lithium prices had fallen to by that point. And, you know, the question was posed, and I pose a question to some people: why wouldn't the cathode producer, the battery producer, install some capacity, get involved in that? Because the premium that you're paying doesn't, you know, would be easily justified by the capex to have a micronization. Now, I know this is on a bigger scale and they're trying to do more, but I think that process upstream, it definitely does, you know, make complete sense. What I think did happen in that lithium conversation was that they probably did a big disservice to lithium converters in the market. You know, you have you have multi-billion-dollar chemical companies that work incredibly hard to add another 10,000 ton capacity, 20,000 ton capacity. It doesn't happen overnight. So to say that, you know, you can add salt and water and sort of have a battery grade chemical, you know, it does a disservice, I think, to a lot of producers out there that are really developing and trying to ramp up for this scale up in demand.
Yeah, I think you're right. Disservice is the word. I mean, let me make this clear. This is about the Tesla management, really, that top level, Elon and the message that we got yesterday on the lithium side, not the people within Tesla, right? We know the people within Tesla, and they're amongst the hardest working people sort of out there, really. And they are, like, we know how hard they worked and we know how good they are. But from that Tesla management perspective, their lithium messaging, one apart from it being a mess, was, you're right, it was a disservice to the industry. I think that's a really good phrase, because you can't get on stage. I understand the principle of trying to simplify the story for investors, a retail investor crowd especially, to understand it. But they also have to understand there is a complexity to getting these materials into a battery. This is a chemical engineering game, which Tesla don't have experience with, but it is an engineering game on a chemical level, in a chemical arena, let's say. And so that makes it very difficult. You can't use all lithium in a battery. The process is extremely important. And as you say, Andy, people have tried it. And the thing I had an issue with, right, was you can't be saying phrases like, on the mining side, where you take a chunk of dirt out of the ground, they just kind of Elon said, then kind of put it back and it's kind of all fine. So I understand he's trying to sort of, you know, make sure the anti-mining crowd aren't on his back. But my God, it is more complex than that. I mean, it's not the most complex part of the supply chain, but simplification doesn't help. Then, as you say, simply mix clay with salt and water. No. And then you have lithium. No. Like, I mean, Vivas, do you have any comments on that?
I want to also add on to what you said about, like, we've talked a lot about the lithium supply chain. I think that there was a bit of a disservice done to the nickel supply chain as well, because one of the statements that was made was, we have talked to, like, there was a very much like build and they will come type of attitude about it. The statement was made by Elon of, well, I talked to the big nickel company CEOs and I told them we need more nickel, so I think they'll produce it. That's not how the industry works. I mean, the industry works based on having an incentive price and guaranteeing a return on invested capital. That's how every single mining company has worked. And the way in which to incentivize the construction of more nickel assets, the development of more mines, and more chemicals capacity is basically to guarantee a price that is above the price that is the prevailing market price today. And so I think that there just wasn't a recognition of that reality during yesterday's presentation.
Yep, that's fair. It's again, nickel's the same as lithium from that sense. It's, I mean, Caspar, you've done a lot of work on the nickel side. There was this news of this sort of new nickel process skipping out. We will get onto silicon anodes as well afterwards, but this skipping out of this nickel stage. Do you want to just explain basics of your take on that, and then some comment?
Yeah, I mean, again, there wasn't, and I understand as kind of what Vivas said, you know, that it wasn't possible to go into the details of all of these different steps, and I understand that there's a need for simplification. So there wasn't much detail on that process, but essentially they said that they've taken the standard process of taking raw materials and creating cathode and simplified it, taking out a load of steps, no need for a sulfate, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, when you produce like a NCM cathode, you start off with what's called precursor, which is a pre-blended mixture of the nickel, cobalt, the manganese sulfates, and then that goes through a process and it becomes cathode. It sounded as though there was no need for that sulfate step. There wasn't too much detail, but I mean, just my take on it, it would have been nice to kind of maybe get a bit more, because at the moment it just sounds, you know, that there's, you know, oh, we just got rid of the step. But all of these companies, these cathode companies, battery companies, whoever it may be, they're all trying to reduce costs. And if it was that straightforward to just get rid of what is it's additional time, additional money, additional chemicals and reagents that are needed to go through that process. If you could just get rid of it really simplistically at large scale, you know, huge volume, 3 terawatt hours of cathode production, it would, you know, everyone would be doing it. And I think, I understand is, you know, you don't want to give away any IP or any kind of value to your competitors, but I don't think it's that straightforward. And this is one of the points where I think perhaps the message felt as though that was something they could either do now or would do as soon as the cathode plant was built. But I think in reality, there's probably still a lot of work to do on developing that. I mean, I could be wrong. As I say, I don't have the detail, but if you could just cut steps out of the battery supply chain to reduce cost, everyone would be doing that. You know, these battery companies have people like LG Chem or Samsung or like CATL. Some of these companies have been working on developing those processes longer than Tesla's been around. It's not that straightforward. So yeah, a bit more detail would be helpful on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Andy, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on those two points.
I was just going to add, and I think, you know, like Caspar says, they can't give away all the detail. And I think that, you know, you do have companies that are obviously looking to integrate more of that nickel, really to open up what you can accept into your supply chain, right? If you're accepting the nickel metal product, then you can, and build that into your precursor production, then, you know, that there's efficiencies to be made there. And I think that's the case across the scope of what they talked about yesterday, not just from a nickel sense, but when you get to these advanced materials, a lot of that makes a huge amount of sense. I think one thing, you know, and I know one thing that we talk about a lot is, you know, the differing timescales at each stage of the supply chain, right? And to build a cathode facility very similar to a battery plant, 12 to 18 months, if you really put the accelerator on, you can have that infrastructure there. But like Caspar says, that doesn't necessarily mean the industry's ready for it or the technology's ready for it. And it's similar with the clay. You know, clay, I think, you know, there's huge potential there. And I think we all accept that for lithium to get anywhere near where it needs to be, you need to develop a lot more different types of resources out there. It can't just all come from brine and spodumene. So, but with that said, companies have been looking to develop clay assets for a long time now. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be ready necessarily if you build a cathode plant in 2 years' time. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting difference in timescale and difference in the messaging about some of the advanced materials and the technology improvements versus just building new capacity.
Before we move on to the cathode anodes, sort of say more anode talk, especially on the silicon side, just an additional comment for lithium. You know, it's our belief that Tesla will be reliant on spodumene, active spodumene supply from Australia for the foreseeable future, next 5 years at least, rather than the lithium assets that aren't in production. Well, let's say their lithium asset, which is probably a piece of ground by the sounds of it. Elon did mention he staked land as well, by the way, so that was a quote from yesterday. We think spodumene from Australia, and then new spodumene operations in North America eventually will be the primary source. But it'll be interesting how that plays out, because these things constantly change. Vivas, I know you've got to go. Do you want to say hi, bye, final statement, and leave us so we can then talk about silicon?
Yeah, this has been a very engaging discussion. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I sincerely apologize for leaving this webinar early. For those of you who don't know, in addition to being at Benchmark, I'm also getting an MBA at Stanford, which is the background that I have behind me. And literally, I have to go to class right now. So that's the reason why I have to drop out. But awesome. I think, so a closing statement from me, but there will, of course, be a continued discussion. is coming into Battery Day, I personally believed that this event had been hyped a little too much because the fact that battery innovation just takes a very long time to happen. And I knew that whatever was announced yesterday would take years to manifest. I sincerely believe that that will still be the case. Of the 50 or so different dollar per kilowatt hour reduction projects that were announced yesterday, what we're going to see 4 to 5 years from now is there's going to be some percentage that have succeeded. There's going to be some percentage that are still in the works, and there's some percentage that are no longer being pursued as projects. The aggregate impact will be a reduction in dollar per kilowatt hour, but I think that the assumption that 100% of what was said yesterday will come to fruition within 2 to 3 years is a misguided assumption. Never underestimate Tesla, but at the same time, let's be real. There is a big industry well beyond Tesla. And the reverberations of the news from yesterday will be felt across everybody. It does raise a new bar. It does raise a bar, and it does create a new impetus for the industry. However, we need a dose of realism when looking at some of the announcements that were made yesterday. So with that, I'll say thank you, everybody. You know how to reach me, LinkedIn or Twitter at Vivas VK7, and the rest of the guys will take it away. Thank you so much.
Nice one. Thanks, Vivas.
Thanks, Vivas.
Yeah, and really well said, actually. Don't underestimate Tesla. Tesla have changed this industry very, very quickly in a 3-year period from 2014 when they built the Gigafactory, and the speed and the quality of cells was kind of took everyone by shock, and then also had the impact on the raw material side as well. So more is yet to come, but Tesla aren't the only game in town now. There's so many lithium-ion battery plants that are going up. Caspar said there's 83. When the Gigafactory first announced, there was 3 of these supersized battery plants. So the competition's high, which is a good reason, it's a great reason for Tesla going down the supply chain and trying to own assets. That is something that, if you want to dominate the future of the electric vehicle industry, you've got to own assets across the supply chain where it makes sense. And that's something that Tesla's strategy is bang on. They're the leaders in that. So I don't want to fill this with too much criticism of Tesla. There are some really interesting and great things going on there. But another area of interest, and it will be probably mostly criticism, will be the silicon anode side of things. That was a standout for me in terms of, firstly, Tesla talking about anodes. Anodes doesn't really get much coverage in the battery space, mainstream, or even on the research side. It felt like from 2014 to 16, 17, cathodes it was all about cathodes, right? It was all about, let's say, different chemistries, maybe some exotic, but the principle is increasing nickel for energy density, decreasing cobalt. Manganese has its role as well, and other additives. And so everything was focused on cathodes, NCA, NCM predominantly. But anodes, the humble graphite anode, which is excellent as an anode, that's why it's used across the board, didn't get much sort of innovation or focus, let's say. But yesterday, the impression was that Tesla were going to 100% silicon anodes. That was the impression I gave. It didn't say the word 100%. But before, I anticipated this, actually, that we were ready to congratulate Tesla on a breakthrough of 10% silicon in a graphite anode. That would have been a breakthrough because the average of the industry is 3 to 6%. You can take an average of 4 or 5, let's say. Because of the reasons Elon outlined, because of the significant expansion, it breaks apart. I think the analogy was a gooey cookie analogy, which I know Andy probably enjoyed that one. But we were going to congratulate him on 10%. That would have been a breakthrough. But the impression they gave was 100%. So Andy, firstly on the anode side, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I took the same, impression from that segment and had to go back and rewatch it to really clarify whether they said 100% silicon, because that's sort of the impression they gave. No, they of course, didn't say that. And I think, just from an initial reaction, we spend a lot of our time on the graphite anode side of the industry, speaking to all of the major producers of anodes and that are involved in that supply chain. And I think, the general reaction to that seems to be pretty unanimously that nothing concrete was, stated. If they are going to use the silicon, it looks like it's going to have to be in conjunction with there's still majority graphite, unless there's been some breakthrough, which they didn't go into detail on yesterday. And I think, ultimately what it will be a progression. It will be a progression in the silicon, which is positive. And we can go up from this 3 to 6% sort of range that we've been capped at for a while. And like you say, if we reach a 10% higher, that can have real benefits. But I don't think the exploring this completely new process is one very viable in the short term. You have companies that are looking at either heavily dominant or silicon dominant, or 100% silicon anodes that have been, again, doing this for years, and even those that have been the most successful at sort of a lab scale, their road to commercialization is still sort of a 5 to 10 year pathway where they're going through consumer electronics. They're starting off in niche applications before they even think about putting this into electric vehicles. So if you can get some benefit that means that the swelling becomes less of an issue, then that's great if you can increase the proportion. But I'm not completely sold on the possibility of that going, like you say, higher than the sort of 10%. And initial reaction from our contacts in Japan, in China, over the course of the day has really been very similar, and they didn't see much to lead them to believe they're going to be able to do more than that.
Yeah, it's funny. We had quite a few phone calls today with battery, let's say, the science community on the battery side, and there was a good comment actually that the silicon anodes have been around since 1990, right? So 30 odd years. So one of our very good contacts, Ryan, explained. He said, "Well, if they've been trying for 30 years, that hasn't been commercially announced, like a pure silicon anode, 100% silicon anode, yet, then unless the laws of physics have changed, there's a big question mark on it." And I mean, as a company in the UK called Nexion, I would have a look at them and the work they've done on the silicon anodes. But definitely, if Tesla came out and said, "Look, we want to use this as an additive. We reckon we can do 10%, and the battery won't break apart over this lifetime." Not cycle usage, but sort of calendar time usage is really important, because also and this will we have to dig into the academia on this, but actually silicon anodes, what Ryan was saying at least, was that actually even when a car's sitting there not being used, charged or discharged, the silicon anodes are still active in some way, and they can still break down. That's something to consider, that there are many issues with this that haven't been resolved. And then Caspar, like the next thing, and so I guess the first question is, like, can they make it work? Watch that space, because it is a big improvement. If any anode is a big way to boost energy density, but graphite, for us, number one, by far, you're going to need scale. It's quality, whether it's natural graphite or synthetic. The volumes you need are ridiculous. Graphite's a number one input raw material into a lithium-ion battery. Let's make that very clear. It's the number one. It's like 1.1, 1.2 kilograms per kilowatt hour. Is that right, Andy? Yeah, it is, isn't it? And that's spherical graphite. That's not flake and stuff. But Caspar, I'm rambling. What's your take on this? Especially the silicon side of the big part seem to be Tesla also innovating on making silicon in a different way, skipping out a step, much like the nickel side of things. That was a big question, because that seemed like that was a big cost reduction of 10x, right? And again, another big question mark.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't want to sound too negative. I think what Tesla's done and has achieved so far and will achieve in the future is incredible. And yeah, I don't want to, this section by its nature is probably going to sound a bit negative, but yeah, again, there was a simplification. Oh, well, silicon's just sand, and we just take sand and we can convert it really cheaply. And then we have this anode material that we can use that's way better than anything that's out there today. I mean, they spoke about the expansion. I mean, during the presentation, there was a schematic of the new pack in particular, when they were talking about using the cans for the cells as part of the structure. And you can see that if that anode is going to swell up to 4x now, depending on how much they charge it, it doesn't necessarily mean it will go 4 times as big. And I don't think the relationship is linear between, if you charge it to half, add half the lithium that you can, it would double the size. I'm not sure exactly of that, but there's no room for expansion, right? The key thing is packing in as much active material in the space as you can. It can't go into the cabin of the vehicle. So that's a huge problem. And they talked about having this elastic binder that will hold the silicon together. But it didn't say that it will control the swelling. I assume it's still going to need to swell. So I think, it leaves a lot of questions. And then the 10x cost reduction on the material that's incredibly cheap. It's far cheaper than anything that's being used in the market today. And if that's achievable, undoubtedly going to have a really considerable impact on the input cost of the cell. But again, loose on details, which we've already covered, that's explainable for a number of reasons. But I think really we're going to need to see some more concrete evidence that that's something that's going to be delivered upon, to include it as part of the cost reduction. Just more essentially, as we've been saying, more leaving lots of questions that we'll wait to hear further, I hope, in the near future.
Yeah, that's interesting. Andy, you do our forecasting data. What can you give it the view as the size of the market now and where we're heading by 2030 from the graphite anode perspective? This is, I guess, and the assumptions there, whether it's 100% graphite and so on.
Yeah, I don't have the precise numbers in front of me, but we're somewhere in the region of about, I think we're forecasting around 250,000 tons anode material this year. And that's going to go up about 10x to around 2.5 million tons by 2030. So, huge scale up. And I think another factor in this, and we're working at the moment on trying to provide a more granular breakdown of different variations of silicon anode and how that impacts things on a cost perspective. But you have to take into account that a huge amount of infrastructure for the anode supply chain has been built out now. And to get to that type of volume, you need that type of infrastructure. Synthetic graphite pricing going into anodes is at record lows in recent months. The capacity that China have built out over the past 2-3 years means that they're producing at a more competitive cost for synthetic graphite than ever before. You're also having expansions in the rest of the world. You're having the blending with natural graphite, which inherently can be and will continue to be lower cost. Again, I think a lot of it comes down to whether you're talking about silicon in a graphite blend, you're talking about pure silicon, but scaling up to make silicon a dominant part of that 3 terawatt-hour goal is pretty ambitious, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah. So I guess the message from us is graphite isn't going anywhere. I mean, there's a reason graphite has been the anode choice since day one, and it's additives and blends of synthetic and natural, and even additives like silicon on a small percentage have really improved the anode. But 100% silicon, no. We do think silicon will be a part of this story, but it's going to be in single-digit percentages unless there is a significant breakthrough. And to be honest, if there is a significant breakthrough, you will hear about it. And it won't be from necessarily, it might be from Tesla, but you will hear about it. So you have to dig for that story. That's gonna naturally come to you. So hopefully that sort of nails. Robert's just got a mess. I'm looking at some questions. There's like loads of questions that we haven't gone through, which is fine. We can do that. Really good question, actually, and it ties in with Robert's question, Cobalt. And the question is, why does Elon Musk have such a visceral reaction to Cobalt? He tweeted about getting Cobalt out of batteries 2 years ago, but there is only $200 of Cobalt in a Tesla today. You can sort of give your opinion on that, Tesla. Caspar, not Tesla, even though that should be your new nickname. I've got so much on my mind. What thoughts? Give us a high level basics of Cobalt, and then walk it back to Tesla's involvement and Elon Musk's reaction.
Yeah, so high level would be, so there's a lot of focus on Cobalt. Typically, Cobalt on a per unit basis is the more expensive of the battery minerals to put into the cell. Just the raw material cost is more expensive. And the price is very volatile. So there's been a lot of focus throughout the industry to reduce dependency on Cobalt. Now, to reduce cost is part of the reason. The other reason is to increase energy density. So Tesla already were a very low cobalt consuming, well, the cathode they use, the battery, the type of materials they use in the battery were very low cobalt consuming. There's also been, for those who don't know, there's been kind of a move to, Cobalt has a brand image issue, I guess is a way to put it, in that about just over 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. And in the DRC, there's a large artisanal mining sector. And part of that mining, those artisanal workers, you know, they mine cobalt. And there are issues there because it's untraceable. Some of those mines have child labor, although it's a very limited amount. And there's kind of ESG issues associated with using cobalt. So there's a number of reasons for a company to want to reduce cobalt in the battery, which is something that's been happening, but it's very challenging because as you reduce the cobalt, you decrease the stability. So Elon kind of touched on this in the presentation, and he used a bookshelf analogy in that the cathode, the material in the cathode with the shelves and the lithium with the books, and the cathode essentially allowed the lithium ions to move between the electrodes. Which is correct, but cobalt's role in that is really, really important. So that is really, it's cobalt that is the kind of stable mineral that provides the structure for the cathode. So they talked about essentially 3 different cathode types in the presentation. They talked about LFP, which doesn't contain any nickel or cobalt at all. Then they had a nickel manganese new cathode formulation that they spoke about. And then they just said high nickel. They didn't really go into any details of what other minerals would be in there, but that's not relevant to this. That if you take cobalt out of this nickel manganese, left with this nickel manganese material, the manganese doesn't want to sit in that crystal structure. Crystal structure is really important to allowing the cathode to essentially work, and it's important to the life cycle. So as soon as that structure starts to break down, the battery deteriorates, and that's like with your smartphone. You know, after a couple of years, you charge it, the battery runs down very quickly because it's deteriorated. So when you take the cobalt out of that manganese doesn't want to sit in that crystal structure, and you get accelerated deterioration. So what a lot of companies are doing are working towards a higher manganese, lower cobalt in some cases. But I think Elon said that in the presentation that it's about 2/3 nickel and 1/3 manganese, and I think that's going to be really challenging. And it's also a surprise that they came out and said that again, there's no timeline. So is this something they're expecting to do when they build the cathode plant, or is it, in my opinion, it's going to take a lot longer to develop than that. But recently, just I think a few weeks ago, Tesla joined the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which is designed at kind of working with the artisanal cobalt industry in the DRC to improve conditions and make it like a clean and trusted source of material. So there's nothing wrong with artisanal mining; it's just mining by hand. Now we do it with machines, but there's nothing wrong as long as it's done safely, somewhere where you're legally allowed to mine. Obviously, no child labor or forced labor or anything like that. So they joined that, which suggests that they want to have a long-term relationship with the cobalt industry. And also in the sustainability report that was published back in, I think it was June, but it was this year anyway, in the summer, there was a section on cobalt sourcing, and Tesla said that we do source DRC cobalt, and we will continue to work with the industry. So it's surprising that they've gone to those steps and then have announced, actually, we don't need cobalt anymore. So I think that perhaps the move towards cobalt-free cathode is aspirational. It's not something they've developed, and I think as I say, they're expecting these batteries, by their own admission, 10 years. They talked about recycling, said 10 years. In reality, as Vivas said earlier, we think those batteries will last a lot longer than that. By removing the cobalt, they put that under question, and perhaps they've had a number of breakthroughs with, I think they mentioned some kind of dopings and coatings that will help, the structure of the battery. But when you're already so low cobalt dependent, consuming, very small amounts of cobalt, certainly compared with the nickel, and the implication for nickel demand of what they said is absolutely vast, which is going to send prices, well, has the potential to send prices one way if they actually deliver on it. I would think there's other. Well, it's just a surprising announcement, and again, I would think there's some timeline to development of that.
Thank you, Caspar. You must have a really knowledgeable conversation with yourself. that's like extremely knowledgeable. And as I Caspar's been with us many years now, and Cobalt was his first love, I would say. But Caspar now runs our price assessment and data department as well. So collecting first-hand data from not just Cobalt market, but lithium, graphite, nickel, battery cells, and so on. So it's yeah, very knowledgeable. I'm impressed with that. One final question, really. There's a lot of questions I've gone through. I'll probably get Robert Colborne to keep searching through if we've not picked up or answered, we've not hit a subject. But one is, I think, from one of our biggest fans, a guy called Ale, and he's asked how many. This is Andrew. I believe this is Andrew Leyland, who's our head of strategic advisory at Benchmark. And but Ale asks, in case it's not him, how many of Tesla's announcements are ready to go versus a product roadmap? So that's actually a really good point. So whilst we're going through all the announcements from yesterday and either saying it's good or being critical, it's a really, Tesla were outlining their product roadmap, their vision, their idea, and Elon did sort of reiterate that. So they did sort of just about cover themselves on the controversial statements, especially of upstream. We're just adding context to that. But Miller, what's your feeling? How many of those? The easy way is to go. How many of those stand out as ready to go? That you go, yeah, I've got confidence that that's ready to go.
I have confidence that I think that when they talk about the cathode plant and what they're looking to do in that layer of integration, you really have to take into account that they're in effect with that. They'd be adding almost another two to three steps in the supply chain, right? Because presumably they'd be doing the precursor, the cathode production, which you can break out into two, as it's done in the majority of the market, and then you'd have some of that raw materials side as well. Now, like you said, there's some issues with the raw material, but I think there's two clear steps in the supply chain there where they can take a much more hands-on role, and that it helps them with some of those cost reductions. I think on that chart, I think you showed on your side, Simon, that was it around cathode was around 17% of those assumed cost reductions, and anode was 13 or something like that. I think that was.
Well, so let me get that slide up now. Actually, I've got it. We've got it to go, right? Hold on.
Yeah. So
yeah, carry on talking, but the slide will go up, but you can talk over it.
Yeah, I just think that is a layer. The advanced materials of the supply chain, I think, is an area where they can relatively quickly have some impact. Whether they can make all the advances they talked about yesterday in the next 2 years, let's say, I'm more skeptical. But what do we have there? What was it in total? So 17% between the two, right? The anode material 5, cathode material 12. So I think there is saving definitely to be made there, and I think that they can have a positive impact to that side. When you get downstream, really, they're effectively at the moment, or will be very shortly, in control of that. So there is room for real change there. So I think as a roadmap, you're going to see a lot of these cost savings just made incrementally. They've obviously spread what they're trying to do over a number of different areas of the supply chain and the business. I expect incremental gains, as you've seen that from Tesla since day one. It's been this constant lowering in cost, lowering in your battery cell costs. So I think that will continue just across a number of fronts. As I say, as we've gone over, I think the upstream is the bigger question, and those technology improvements are going to take more time.
Yeah, it was my feeling actually that before the announcements yesterday, I was anticipating Tesla to drop with just a new cell format. This is and packing more active material in a bigger space and not having as much metal and space within the pack. I figured that innovation alone could take the cost at a cell level from $97 per kilowatt hour at the Gigafactory below 90. Really, I was thinking between $85 and $90 once they introduce that new cell format. Now, obviously, that's way off the 56, or it's not 56, it'll be 49% minus the cell vehicle integration for cell level. It's way off their 47% reduction, but you can easily see that they don't have to nail every single one of the things they said to continue to reduce the price of the cell. Now, the question is, when lithium's price goes up, when nickel's price goes up, cobalt's still in there, manganese is a question, but lithium and nickel especially, what happens then, Caspar?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I just want to say as well, but I think that a lot of the things that Tesla have discussed, you know, are theoretically achievable. I think it's just going to take a lot longer than perhaps it felt in the actual presentation itself, and maybe we'll get some more details on timelines later. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, you can't get around. Oh, okay, so if they're, you know, theoretically doing their own lithium mining, they can control the cost of that. But nickel mining, I mean, essentially what you're looking at now, you know, Elon said, oh, we spoke to all the big nickel mining CEOs, and we think they're going to, you know, start increasing their nickel production. But I mean, I did do some numbers just on the nickel demand, and I tried to reduce it as low as possible from that 3 terawatt-hour figure in 2030. I've got some slides actually, so I can just call these up and I'll go into it.
Nice.
Excuse, these are hastily put together, so they're quite basic. But yeah, so 3 terawatt hours of cells. They didn't stipulate what that would be, but I tried to just take some information out of the presentation and work out, you know, what those different materials would be that go into those cells, and therefore what the nickel demand would be. So this was one of the slides from the presentation, which that first third, the iron base, obviously contains no nickel. Now, Tesla didn't stipulate whether their in-house production would be just the nickel-based chemistries, or also they would produce LFP cells. But in the interest of trying to reduce the nickel demand for Tesla in 2030 from their projected 3 terawatt hours of production, I assumed that they would. So I said that I think our number in 2030, in terms of ESS, you know, the percentage contribution to total lithium-ion demand is around 15% by 2030. I thought, well, I'll double that and assume that Tesla is a market leader in stationary storage. So that will take, so if we say 30% of that 3 terawatt hour number is going to be the large storage-based systems they've got on the left-hand side there. So that, sorry, yeah, so they're basically, yeah, so they're the raw materials of the different different cathode types. So we're saying about 2/3 nickel in that nickel manganese one, and let's assume high nickel content above 90 in the other one. So once you take the storage factor in, we reduce that production down to say that 2 terawatt hours of those cells will be going into applications like EVs or power or semi or something like that. So then moving forward from the presentation again, I took this as a rough metric. I know this isn't necessarily what the sales will be made up of in Tesla, but a rough metric saying that this is roughly how they see their percentage sales breakdown. This was looking at electric transportation as a whole, but we can assume that by 2030 they'll have a broad market appeal and will be delivering all these products. And I said that all of the small robotaxi will be small vehicles and robotaxi will be LFP chemistries, and 50% of the mid-size will be LFP, which I personally think is potentially being generous. I would say that it would probably be less than 50% of those mid-size vehicles would use the LFP cells, but just in the interest of trying to reduce this nickel number down. So from their 2 terawatt hours, about 1,350 gigawatt hours will be nickel consuming chemistries. And from this split that's remaining, around 1,000 gigawatt hours will be the high intensity nickel, the more than 90%, and then 350 gigawatt hours. These are all my assumptions. I mean, you can change these as you want, but this was just something I put together quickly today. 350 gigawatt hours of nickel manganese cathode. When you put that in, and I came up with some implied nickel consumption factors, which again are kind of a market average from what I think is plausible, that would suggest that Tesla will use over 1.1 million tons of nickel in 2030 alone. And that's realistically pushing that number down again, saying, assuming they're going to make LFP, there wasn't confirmation that they would do that, or it would just be the nickel chemistries. At the moment, they obviously buy in LFP from CATL, which is a huge number. So to put that into context, the nickel market this year will be about 2.3 million tons. Supply will increase to something like by another 2 million tons, something like 4.3 million tons. You know, that's also, those additional tons are going to be at higher capex, because a lot of that supply will be coming from aged power operations, which typically have a high capex requirement. So that's sort of suggesting that Tesla's going to need about half of all new nickel supply that comes online over the next decade just to supply themselves, or about 100,000 tons of additional material per year needs to come into the market by then. And then the recycling question, you know, Tesla spoke about recycling. Just a very quick, very easy calculation. Tesla selling about 400,000 vehicles this year, or expected to, something like that. And about 50 kilos of nickel in each vehicle is about 20,000 tons. So if Tesla recycled every car they sell, they recycle 100% of the batteries. And they said it's about a 10-year cycle. So I said sales this year for 2030, recycling would be about 20,000 tons. So recycling is not going to answer that question if that's the route they go down, just recycling Tesla material. So, you know, that's another big question mark. If they produce those cells, where's that nickel going to come from? It's going to be extremely challenging, and they're going to be also fighting with other battery manufacturers, the stainless steel industry. You know, there's a lot of materials to come up with. Now, that was a very quick calculation. Obviously, I did that this afternoon whilst responding to incoming queries, but, you know, that's kind of, well, I mean, you're going to need higher pricing. You're going to need higher incentive pricing. So, yeah, that will, you know, cause them a big problem when so much of they're so nickel dependent. And you know, for cobalt as well, again, even, you know, as they are very, very low cobalt dependency already. So I would need to do some more time to do some numbers on that. But, you know, equally, if Tesla are producing 3 terawatt-hours of cells by 2030, every single number out there in terms of the forecast is off by a significant factor, shall we say. Maybe you'd need to double your forecast for the majority of people probably by 2030. So yeah, prices will go one way, and we've already got this huge deficit coming, so it would send it one way.
The wall of demand is coming. The wave of demand has happened, and now there's a big wall we're facing. That as we say, a benchmark, it takes 18 to 24 months to build a battery plant. It takes 7 years to build a mine, and they're the kind of generous timelines at the moment. But of course, then you need money to be invested to build these mines, and that money isn't coming forth at the moment, whilst the downstream continues to build significantly. So we shall see how this plays out. I mean, to summarize and probably finish this webinar, because we've gone on for quite a while now, to summarize that question from Andy, actually, we do think downstream, we're very positive on Tesla. I mean, Tesla are the leader in our business, right? And they created these new blueprints and changed the way the industry operates, and have done that forever. So there wouldn't be the scale without Tesla. So downstream, we're really confident on the new cell format. That'll be really interesting to see how that gets developed once they're integrated into electric vehicles. That'll be one to watch. This tabless design is really interesting as well as part of that. So that they're kind of like ticks for us to, you know, definitely not just part of the product roadmap. They're kind of a go. Let's see what happens. There's a group in the middle, which are kind of big maybes, like the dry electrode process, silicon. Now, how much silicon they're putting in, that's a big maybe. Silicon will be in there, but how much is the question? You know, will it go over 10%? We certainly don't believe it'll be 100%, but they're in the middle. And then, of course, the kind of the red flags, the big sort of no-nos. So at the moment is Tesla's, the land they've staked in Nevada for the lithium clay. It's not a company they've acquired. There are companies there that have done a lot of work. Lithium Nevada is one of them. That was Western Lithium before. They've been working on this for 10 plus years. And so they're companies to really dig into. But otherwise, just Tesla staking land and saying they can do this, that's a big red flag for me. And then the new nickel route that Caspar explained as well, skipping out of that stage in this supply chain for nickel and for silicon. I mean, it's just not that simple. These are chemically engineered, high-spec products. There's definitely innovation there that can happen, but overall, it's one to watch. So that's kind of it from me, and I shall give Andy a final goodbye statement, and then Caspar a final goodbye statement, and then we'll wave and leave everyone to it. We'll wave in unison at the same time.
Okay, give me a heads up. I think from my side, I'm going to finish on a positive, and I think the couple of positives that I really took from yesterday are one, that taking things to a new scale, and the industry, has been on this gradual trajectory ever since the Gigafactory was announced. And now, like they said yesterday, now Terra is the new gigawatt hour, right? So I think that's going to set a precedent, and you're going to see a lot more people moving in that direction, if not to quite that scale. And the second one, which we haven't really talked about, but I thought was a really interesting centerpiece of everything that was really discussed yesterday, was the issue of sustainability. We've obviously seen that become a huge driving force behind the market across the supply chain over the past couple of years, something we're doing a lot more work on. And it's good to see that getting a lot more attention. So I'll finish on those couple of positives from my side.
Yeah, I think I would like to finish on a positive note. I mean, if Tesla can achieve these savings in the cell cost, it would be incredible. And as I said, I think what they've done has already been incredible. I mean, I want to buy Tesla, so if they can get the cells cheap, that's great for me. So let's hope they do it. But yeah, I think more, there's certainly some things here which are really interesting. I think are imminently achievable, and will make a big difference to the product offering from Tesla and the company. I think really just want to say that, yeah, maybe we need to temper some of the expectations of when these things might or can happen. But yeah, generally, this industry needed someone like Tesla to come in, or a company like Tesla to come in and really just push the boundaries of what's possible and really open the world's eyes to what can be done. And they're doing that. So yeah, good luck to them, I say.
Yeah, nice one. And I've just got a message actually from James Hayter, who's watching. James was one of the key people developing Western Lithium deposit, which is now Lithium Nevada, with Jay Shamalaskas. And he just sent me a photo, which is 10 years ago on Monday at the deposit. And so these things take time, and James would like to mention as well. It also shows that we've been in this industry a long time, and it still feels brand new. And that's mainly thanks to Tesla, and then everyone else following the footsteps that they've kind of gone into. So on that note, hopefully positive with some constructive comments and criticism. You can follow us on Twitter at BenchmarkMin. I'm at SDMoores. What are you, Andy Miller?
A_Miller_BMI, like benchmark mineral intelligence, not body mass.
And Caspar, what are you?
At CDM Rawles.
Excellent. Thank you all for tuning in. The engagement's been awesome, and continue the conversation online. We're here to help and give any independent opinion we can, and we keep going on. Wave in unison.